Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Envision IT Office 365 Productivity Series. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about hybrid Office 365, Azure, and SharePoint On-Premise scenarios and licensing. It's a mouthful, I know, and licensing is always a challenging one when you get into it. Let me just start with some quick introductions. I'm Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a Microsoft Canada Partner Seller. My contact information is up here on the slide deck. And we're going to be posting the slides as well as the recording from today's session up on our site at www.envisionit.com/event. So if you want to pull that down for later reference, or if you have somebody who wasn't able to join, wants to be able to see the content that we're going through this afternoon, that should be up there by tomorrow. A quick agenda in terms of what we're going to cover off today. We're going to start with a very brief overview of Envision IT. We're going to talk about cloud security for a bit. I mean, this is one of the main drivers around hybrid scenarios. We'll get into a couple case studies, some of the projects we've done in Office 365. Everybody's favorite topic with Microsoft, licensing, the nuances. I won't promise to make you a licensing expert at the end of this, but I hope we'll cover off most of the things that you'll need to be thinking about as you're licensing your on-premise or cloud SharePoint. We'll take you through a number of different scenarios of what some of these hybrid scenarios that we're talking about could look like from there. Please don't hold your questions to the end. We've got a fairly small group with us today, so we're going to be grabbing questions as we go through. I've got Amanda with me here as well. She's going to be moderating and flagging questions out. So we're going to stop as we go through there. If there's specific points you want to go deeper on, you want clarification on, don't be afraid. Please post those up into the Q&A in the GoToMeeting session. So as I promised, we'll keep this very brief. A quick overview on who Envision IT is. We are, as we call ourselves now, Office 365 Productivity Consultants. We've been known as a SharePoint boutique for 10 plus years now, really doing a pivot around the cloud and the cloud productivity side of things. SharePoint websites, intranets, extranets, collaboration portals are what we were known best for, whether that's on-premise or in the cloud. Been around for more than 2 dozen years. A gold partner, multiple award winners, including most recently we got the Metalogic Best of Breed at the Ignite conference back in May, and actually last week at Worldwide Partner Conference won an IMCP award, both for an Office 365 solution we're going to be covering as part of our case studies. So in terms of services that we provide across those 4 main foundations of the public websites, intranets, extranets, and portals, within that we do have a number of services driving deeper into that. So we do SharePoint Farm Health Checks. So if you've got an on-premises farm, whether that's 2007, 2010, 2013, you want an outside opinion on how healthy it is, what sort of shape it's in, what remediation maybe needs to be done on it. We have a standard package around that. We've got our Azure and Office 365 cloud services. We do work around accessibility for Ontario and Disability Act compliance for public websites. Dealing with upgrades and migrations, whether those are on-premise to on-premise or on-premise into the cloud. Training, mobile first design work, both for public sites and for collaboration portals. Ongoing support for your SharePoint infrastructure, and solution architecture and design work, workflows, and forms. So a broad set of services around the broader SharePoint banner. So before we get too deep in here, I just want to start with a quick poll and get a sense. I'm assuming that most of you are using SharePoint today if you're thinking about a hybrid solution, and I want to get an idea, is that 2013, 2010, full server, foundations, are you on an older MOS 2007 or WSS 3.0? I'm just going to open up this poll here and give you a minute just to answer back from that, and I'll share the results back from that once we get through that. And the hybrid scenarios that we're going to talk about here today, primarily when Microsoft thinks about hybrid, they think about Office 365 and SharePoint 2013 on-premise. It doesn't have to be exclusively that. We have scenarios, in fact, we have clients we're talking to now that have existing 2010, where they're looking to migrate some of that up into the cloud and keep what's private and confidential that they don't want to put in the cloud in the existing on-premise 2010. So we can slice and dice this in a number of different ways. So I'll give you another 15 seconds or so, just the last few people, if you can give me a sense of which versions you're currently running on there, and then we'll share that back. All right, then let me just share that up. So about half folks on SharePoint Server 2013, so that's good to see. People fairly current from an on-premise. That is the most recent version. There is discussions and talks around SharePoint 2016. There was some interesting talks around that at Ignite back in May. It's still probably less than a year now. It's going to be early 2016 when we see that out in general availability. But if 30 is still on SharePoint Server 2010, and then the other third back on the previous version before that, either MOS 2007 or WSS 3.0. So a good mix of platforms that people are on there. Let me just hide that and come back to my presentation deck here. So we're going to talk about three broad ways that you can deploy SharePoint, and they make sense in different scenarios, and we'll talk about those scenarios towards the end of the session. Really, that's Office 365 and SharePoint Online, and I'll lump those together. From a SharePoint point of view, they're much the same. Office 365 just includes the broader set of productivity components like your mail, your link, your Yammer, and such, all fall under that. And we'll talk about the licensing differences between the full 365 versus the SharePoint Online. Then you've got your traditional SharePoint On Premises, which I mentioned most of you are running today, and then running SharePoint in Azure, which is a little different than Office 365. In 365, we call it a software as a service. Microsoft basically manages and runs everything for you. So not only you're not running on your physical hardware, but you're also not maintaining it. Microsoft takes care of that for you. So it's a nice, complete package solution for you. There's certain workloads and scenarios that we'll talk about that don't make sense in Office 365. Those could make sense in Azure for you if you do want to be in the cloud. You do have the responsibility, the care and feeding of the infrastructure in the farm in that case, but Microsoft makes sure that the lights are on and the servers are running from that point of view. So it's sort of a hybrid within hybrid there. Okay. So what are some of the barriers to the cloud? Why wouldn't people just go 100% into the cloud and not worry about all this hybrid nonsense? One of the big ones is SharePoint customizations. People have done a lot of code customizations to their SharePoint installation for specific business processes, user experiences, things that they're doing in their site, whether that's your intranet, your public-facing site, your extranet, what have you from there. Microsoft, and quite understandably, doesn't want you running those customizations on their server farms. They have massive, massive farms that are running tens of thousands of tenants in a multi-tenant environment. They can't have one of those tenants running their code on their server and cause something to go wrong and take out those tens of thousands of clients. That's just not acceptable from a service level agreement point of view. So they basically say, look, you can't run those customizations on your on our server that we host in a multi-tenant environment. And they've really been pushing that for the last while. I mean, they had sandbox solutions that came out in SharePoint 2010. They've kind of moved away from that, and everything's pushed towards the app model in SharePoint 2013, which basically says if you're going to build custom code, do it off the SharePoint server somewhere, either in the browser in SharePoint hosted apps or on another server altogether in provider hosted apps. And I won't get too deep into that, but that's one of the big barriers that we see to moving to the cloud is it takes time to re-engineer those applications and make them work in that model. The other two biggies, though, are around data security and data sovereignty. And although they're closely related, I see there's different points to consider on each of those. So let's actually dive deeper into the security and sovereignty side of things. So there's a ton of information that Microsoft publishes online in their Office 365 Trust Center that talks about all the amazing things they do in order to secure your data and protect your data. But what I thought I'd do is take you through a number of slides here that we did with a roundtable with a number of our clients about a month or two ago. And basically, it was comparing what many clients do on premises versus what Microsoft does in the cloud from a security point of view. And the first thing that most people honestly often forget about is physical security. You know, where are your servers physically located? Are they in a locked, isolated, controlled server room, or does some of them happen to be sitting underneath somebody's desk or maybe not properly controlled? Physical access is the easiest way for hackers to get into your system. They can use social hacking as well as part of that, gain access. They could impersonate workers or telco staff, things like that, to get into your data center and gain physical access to your computer. So if they can get to a USB port on your server, you're basically toast. I mean, they can pretty much take over the server at that point in time there. So really making sure that those servers are isolated, there's restricted access, that access is logged and audited, and it's safe from social attacks, is something that you really need to do. And Microsoft obviously does this very well. They've got biometric, motion sensors, 24-hour security, video, security breach alarms. I mean, it's a very robust data center environment. It's very tough to get in there and physically hack your way into that environment. So I would give the checkmark to Microsoft to say they're probably well ahead of what most, if not all, organizations are doing from that point of view. From an audit perspective, unless you're a big 5 bank or a large enterprise, you're probably not doing any auditing on your infrastructure. So you may not even be aware that there's hacks going on. This is a kind of a scary statistic I've seen from Microsoft. I believe it was around on the order of 9 months is the time from when an initial hack occurs to an organization to when that organization actually realizes that that hack has occurred. So there's a lot of damage that can be done in that 9 months of time. Microsoft obviously is going under continuous auditing. If you go to their Trust Center link that I provided on the previous slide, you'll see there's a lot of different organizations. There's ISO standards, there's EU standards, there's Department of Defense stuff. So it's basically a rolling roundtable of audits that they're going through. As soon as they finish one audit with one of those certification organizations, the next one's coming in and continuing from there. So very robust from that point of view. Just logging what's happening. Once you discover that 9 months ago somebody got into your system, what have they done since then? What sort of logging do you have? What can you discover around what they've done there? And the first thing hackers do is basically erase their footprints and erase all those logs. So what sort of log shipping and consolidation do you have in place? Again, a lot of organizations just don't do this. It's not that they're that negligent, it's just they're not aware of all the best practices that should be done from a security point of view. Microsoft obviously is and is taking those steps on your behalf. Even backups, where do you take your backups? Does your sysadmin back them up onto a USB hard drive and take them home when they sit on the front seat of their car? Is that drive even encrypted? So, again, things to think about. Maybe you're using cloud-based backup and you're already in the cloud and you're afraid of moving your main SharePoint infrastructure into the cloud, but the reality is all your data is there already. So some questions to ask if you're a business person within your organization. Again, how does that compare to what Microsoft is doing? Data encryption, are the disks being encrypted? Are you using HTTPS secure publishing so that the data in transit is encrypted? Yes to both of those on the Microsoft side, both at rest and in transit, even between the Microsoft data centers. As data is traveling across there, that's encrypted as well. Search and seizure. If law enforcement decides that maybe not you as a business, but maybe somebody in your employ has done something illegal and they have warrants to seize information off your systems, that may result in your computers actually being physically seized. So they could show up at your front door and there'd be physically nothing that you could do to prevent them from walking into your server room and walking out with your servers. I mean, the reality is I actually spoke with local law enforcement around this. They try and avoid that. If the business is not involved in the illegal operation and the business is cooperative, they want to try and allow that business to operate as much as possible. But at the end of the day, the police can't show up at Microsoft's data center store with a warrant and walk in and start pulling hard drives out. It just doesn't work in that environment. And Microsoft is always going to resist those demands. They're going to push them back. Their legal argument, and they're taking it all the way to the Supreme Court, is that they don't own that data. The customer owns that data. They're just the holder of the data. If you want access to it, doesn't matter if you're NSA, if you're the Canadian government, if you're local law, what have you, you need to serve that warrant against the local business. You're actually more protected from government access in most scenarios by having your data up in the cloud. So just something to think about. I mean, people have an emotional response that my data is more safe if I keep it in my own building. The actual rational response to that is, in most cases, no, it's not. Even data sovereignty is more of an emotional thing. A lot of people feel, well, NSA is spying on our data. We're a Canadian organization, but our data is sitting in a U.S. data center. We don't like that. We're not comfortable with that. The reality is there's cross-border bilateral security provisions that U.S. security can access Canadian and Canadian access U.S. They can get your data whether it's in Canada or U.S. They follow the proper processes through there. But nevertheless, this has been a big barrier. Microsoft Canada has been asking for years now to say, we need a data center in Canada. And the issue is that these data centers that Microsoft builds are massive, massive scale. They call them hyperscale. There's only 3 hyperscale vendors in the world. It's Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, and Google. And Microsoft is certainly leading the field in terms of the number of regional data centers that they have. They're actually in more countries than both Amazon and Google combined together. And on June 4th, they announced that they're going to open 2 Canadian data centers. Now, because Canada is a smaller market, they're not actually going to build a purpose-built, massive-scale data center, which usually takes 2 to 3 years for Microsoft to construct from announcement to completion. They're actually going into existing commercial data centers in Toronto and Quebec City, and they're going to be bringing Azure online first this fall. So we're actually not that far away from it. General availability is going to be coming in the beginning of 2016. Office 365 is going to come after Azure, so they haven't announced the firm dates for that, but we expect to see that in the next 12 months or less from where we are now. So we're going to get more details as that comes together, but that's pretty exciting news for Canada, because that really takes the data sovereignty questions off of the table. And the data security questions, as I showed you, clearly weigh in Microsoft's favor over most of what most organizations are doing on premises today. So, I mean, why would you actually want to move to the cloud? So we talked about all the fears and the barriers. Let's talk about the advantages to moving to the cloud. And first and foremost is the lower cost. You know, that hyperscale that Microsoft is operating at allows them to provide basically compute capacity at a cost factor that you just can't compete with as an individual organization. They're looking at building out such massive scale and taking into account, you know, where those data centers are, access to power, to cooling, to things to drive down the cost of compute. Because that cost is basically coming down to power cost effectively. And the more efficient they can be at that, that's ecologically good from a green point of view, but it's also good from a cost point of view, and they can pass those cost savings on. Very competitive. Amazon and Microsoft are basically neck and neck with each other, and every time one of them takes a step and moves their prices, the other one does the same as well. So it really drives those costs down. Microsoft also has a cloud-first strategy, which means everything that they're building, everything net new that they're creating, whether we're talking about SharePoint or any of their other products, it's all about cloud-first. So feature sets that we're going to see are always going to happen online in the cloud version first, and at some later time they're going to come on-premise. And that's really what we're seeing with SharePoint 2016, is it's the first on-premise version that's based on what's in the cloud. In the past, things went the other way. SharePoint 2013 was built as an on-premise, and then it was adapted to run in the cloud. But as Microsoft runs it at this hyper-massive scale, they need to do tweaks and changes to that to support that scale. So as they've improved the product, made it more patchable, more reliable, more scalable, they're actually bringing those feature sets on-premise as part of SharePoint 2016. And that's what we're going to see in the future. All net new features will happen in the cloud first, and then they may or may not come on-premise. So there's cloud-only feature sets like Yammer, Delve, the next-gen portals. Most of those have been declared by Microsoft that they will remain cloud-only. So they're not part of SharePoint 2016, nor are they planned for future SharePoint on-premises either. Delve arguably is coming on-premise, but really what that is a connector you put into your on-premise that feeds that search data up into the cloud. So it's still a hybrid cloud solution. It's not an on-premise only. Yammer, they've said, is always going to be cloud only. Video and knowledge management, their next-gen portals, same thing there. Those are clearly cloud only, no plans at this time to bring those on-premise. So if you want to take advantage of those productivity benefits of being on the latest for Microsoft, the cloud is the place to do that at a lower cost as well. So let me take you through a couple of case study scenarios here just to talk about some of our experience with clients in the cloud and what that looks like. So the first one I'm going to chat with is Media Experts. And this is a Montreal-based media planning and buying company. They're focused on the Canadian market. And they had an intranet on MOS 2007. So about a third of you answered to the poll saying we're still on MOS 2007 WSS 3.0. You're in the same place that Media Experts was about a little over a year ago, I guess it was, when we first started working with them. And the original plan was actually to migrate them to SharePoint 2013 from 2007. The idea was we were going to build an intermediate 2010 farm, migrate from 2007 to 2010, and then back that up and migrate that to 2013, because there's no direct path unless you use third-party tools to go right from 2007 to 2013. Partway through that process, they started looking into cloud economics and said, you know what, from a cost point of view, this doesn't make sense. We should be just going into the cloud. And we don't have an issue from a data sovereignty and security point of view. We're comfortable with that. We're actually just going to move all of our information into the cloud. So they weren't a hybrid. They were just a whole hog. Let's take everything on 2007, pick and choose what needs to migrate versus be archived, and move that up into the cloud. So they use Metalogix, which is a third-party tool, to actually do that migration and push that content up into the cloud. There were some challenges there. We actually did a lot of that migration work for them. The primary one being it actually takes a long time to move things into the cloud. Particularly at that point in time, the bandwidth to push what was getting close to half a terabyte of data into the cloud wasn't hours or days, it was weeks or months, and that becomes a real challenge. You can't say, don't use your SharePoint for the next 2 months while we migrate it. You really have to do a hybrid. So we actually built a hybrid solution for them as a temporary solution. We maintained SharePoint 2007, and we piecemeal moved things across into Office 365. We basically had a common branding and a common navigation across that, so people really didn't notice that. They felt like they were in one SharePoint. Other than looking at the URL, they didn't recognize that, hey, they were actually moving between the two different versions. And ultimately, when all of the migration was complete, the MOS 2007 got shut down. So the hybrid here wasn't a long-term strategy. It was actually part of a migration strategy. At Ignite back in this past May, though, Microsoft announced some significant changes to the migration story. They've opened up a path for the vendors to migrate content through Azure and into Office 365 that gives them orders of magnitude increase in terms of that amount of time it takes to do that migration. It probably still would have taken longer than a weekend to do a half terabyte migration, so there'd still be a requirement potentially for some hybrid in there, but it took it from weeks and months down into days rather than weeks. So a significant change there. Travel Corporation is actually a company that really started on the Yammer side and then embraced SharePoint. So not your typical journey, but it's been an interesting one for them. A lot of companies maybe aren't so keen on enterprise social, which is what Yammer is all about. Travel Corporation has really embraced that. I mean, they manage the Contiki, Travel, a number of other brands worldwide, so both here in Canada, the US, and around the world. And what this project was to build a collaboration portal for their reps, their staff, to be able to find, discover, and collaborate on all the rich content that they create around all the travel packages that they have, and publish those out through a SharePoint experience, and then leverage Yammer and Enterprise Social to really get the conversations and discussions going around that, which has worked really well for them. So we worked with them to deliver the Canadian solution, and we built it in a way that it could be templated and brought to the other regions. They've now taken that to 11 of their 13 other regions around the world. The last two are going to be done by October, I believe, of this year. So a very successful project for them. I'm very excited about what they're doing in Office 365. So not so much a hybrid, but a good example of an organization that's adapting Office 365. Pathways to Education, this is a great not-for-profit organization that works with troubled teens, youth. How do they get the high school dropout rate down, the graduation rate up, get people onto post-secondary education, and really work one-on-one with challenged youth in order to get them through the education system successfully. So they've got lots of learning, lots of information they want to provide out to their staff to work with those youth, and again, Office 365 is a great way to do that. Not a big organization. Building up all that infrastructure on-premise just doesn't make a lot of sense. So this is a common theme that we see. If you're even a mid-sized organization, if you're a small organization for sure, but if you're even a 500-person organization, do you want to be running a multiple server SharePoint farm that requires some fairly particular technical expertise to keep it going? Probably not. Putting that up in Office 365 really solves that for you. Same sort of situation with Ontario Association of Children's Aid Society. This is actually the project that we won awards at Impact and Worldwide Partner Conference the last 2 months for as well. And much the same type of scenario. They're about a 65-person organization. Their members, though, number around 8,000 across the province that belong to the various different children's aid societies. So those members need to come in, find resources, find training materials, sign up for training, and that's a big part of the mandate for OCAS, is to provide that training and those resources out to the members. So they've got literally thousands of documents and pages and content up in this Office 365 site. And they'd actually started with an on-premise and found that, yeah, they just didn't have the expertise nor the desire to run and operate their own infrastructure. So 365 made a lot of sense for them to do that. Pynchon, again, not a not-for-profit, but a for-profit organization, engineering firm. But again, the training and mentoring around how to use Office 365, document management, using it for collaboration, search, workflow, alerts, all the standard SharePoint features that you have on-premise, having those available in Office 365. So everyone's favorite topic, how do people license these? We've talked about some interesting solutions. Well, what do we have to actually purchase in order to make that happen? So I'm going to take you through the main three buckets, which is around on-premises, Azure, and Office 365. We're going to start with on-premise. So there were some changes that some people still aren't necessarily aware of around SharePoint 2013 licensing. So depending on whether you're talking about an internal portal that's just for your staff, or it's an external portal that is going to be an extranet or a public-facing website, you needed to have, for external sites, this for Internet sites license. It was quite expensive in SharePoint 2007 and 2010. 2013, they got rid of that, so that saves some pretty significant licensing dollars. And whether you're using that on-premise or in Azure or in a third-party hosting environment, the same applies from that point of view. So if we look at 2010 versus 2013, a number of you are still back on 2010 or even on 2007. The thing to think about there is also software assurance. So software assurance is a bi-yearly fee that you pay to Microsoft to stay current on your licensing. And what that means is you don't need to then repurchase brand new licenses when you upgrade, you're already current. So even though you're running on 2010 perhaps, if you've got software assurance, it means you have the right to move to 2013. A lot of organizations don't buy software assurance, so if you're on 2007 or 2010, you may be locked back on that version, and you'd actually need to purchase new licenses for that. So if we look at the differences between 2010 and 2013, for internal users, it's the same. Basically, your internal staff need to buy a server license for each SharePoint server, and then what's called a client access license, or a CAL, for each end user. Extranets, you either had to buy CALs or that expensive FIS license in 2010. In 2013, you no longer had to do that. You just buy your server license and you're done. Likewise for public-facing sites. So that can save you a lot of money from a licensing point of view. From an on-premise Office web apps point of view, this is another feature that works closely with SharePoint. It basically lets you either read or edit Office documents in a browser without having those Office applications installed on your machine. And for your internal staff, if they just want to read documents, they actually don't need an Office client whatsoever. If they're going to be doing editing to use the browser-based clients, they just need to be licensed for desktop. Whether the desktop is installed or not doesn't really matter. The main thing is just, are they licensed? If you have external users coming in, it's nice because there's no license required either for reading or editing documents. It's free for all of those external users to use. So that's a nice story from a licensing point of view. So let's kind of recap what you need on premises for licensing. So as I mentioned, each internal user needs a client access license, or a CAL, to access SharePoint. Now there's two flavors of that. There's a standard and an enterprise version. So enterprise builds on top of standard. You actually need to buy both of them if you're getting enterprise. You need a standard and an enterprise CAL. So what does enterprise give you that standard doesn't have? It gives you some additional search features. Entity extraction, which is the ability to get metadata and refiners based on the content in your search results, the video search, the recommendations. Some of the more advanced search features like the content search web part are part of the enterprise workflow. There are certain business solutions. So if you want to use access in the browser, that's called access services, or InfoPath in the browser, which is InfoPath services. That requires the enterprise CAL. And a number of the BI or business intelligence features like Power View, Performance Point, Excel services, Visio services, those all require the enterprise license as well. If you're not using any of those services, then you're fine to have the standard CAL. And you can mix and match that. You can say, well, you know what, we've got maybe 100 of our 500 users that need to do the BI work that needs the enterprise CAL. So buy 100 enterprise CALs for them and buy standard CALs for everybody else. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. There's a good overview link that I provided there that you can dive deeper into to see those differences and what that means. Now, it's not just the CALs, though. There's some other licenses that you need to get as well. So you need to buy a SharePoint server license for each server that's running SharePoint. If you think about a typical SharePoint farm, it has one or more web front ends, one or more app servers, and one or more SQL servers. So those first two tiers, the web front end and the app servers are running SharePoint. They need a server license for those servers. The SQL server obviously needs to be licensed as well. And there's two ways you can license that. You can get what's called a core license. So each core on the SQL server you buy a license for. And that doesn't matter how many people access that, you're good from a licensing point of view. Or you can buy a server license and SQL CALs for each user as well. If you're going to be opening up for public websites or extranets where you don't know who all the users are going to be, you have to do the core license. But if it's strictly internal only, you may have the CAL for SQL as part of your enterprise agreement with Microsoft. And I won't get into open licensing versus enterprise agreements. There are different ways of procuring your licenses. That adds another layer of complexity in there as well. And you obviously need to license the Windows server, the base operating system software that's running on each of those servers as well. So those are all the licenses you need from an on-premises SharePoint point of view. Now, what if we put that in Azure? First off, what is Azure? Azure is a cloud-based infrastructure as a service where you can basically run virtual machines, virtual servers in the cloud on Microsoft hardware. So the licensing is actually exactly the same as on-premises. The servers are managed by you. You need to buy the licenses just like you would for your on-premise. The only thing that's different is the Windows Server license is actually baked into the subscription you pay for Azure. So you don't have to buy the server license, but you still have to buy the SharePoint Server license. SQL Server is a mixed bag. You can actually look at that either as baked into the Azure subscription, or you can bring your own license up into the cloud. There's two options there. There's actually a blog post. I thought I had a link in there. I may have it later, but let me pull it up for you now here. So if you go to my blog site, and there's a link to that on the beginning of the deck, a couple months ago I actually published a white paper and a calculator around this exact scenario. It's a public website in Extranet Azure architecture. If you drive into that, it'll give you a sense, and there's a summary here on the main blog post. There's a much deeper pricing calculator that lets you get into your own scenarios. It shows you the different types of farms and what sort of costs you would be talking about from an Azure point of view. Starting from a basic, I just have a 4-server environment that's non-highly available. That means if one of those servers goes down, the environment goes down. It's not redundant. Looking at just under $2,000 a month for that, and about $18K in SharePoint and SQL licenses that you need to purchase for that environment. It goes up from there all the way to saying, okay, well, I want a highly available 8-server farm that if any of those 1 servers goes down, the environment continues to function properly. That's actually a fairly important thing in Azure because you can't necessarily predict when Microsoft's going to do maintenance on those virtual machines and take one of those VMs down. So if you want the full service level agreement from Microsoft, you actually need to do a highly available environment. But obviously the costs are roughly double what the cost for a non-highly available, which makes sense. You're putting double the infrastructure in there. Okay. So that was on-premise and Azure. The third one we want to cover is Office 365. This gets fairly complicated as well. So 365 is not just SharePoint. It's a broader suite that covers desktop, mobile, and browser-based productivity. So email, calendar, your Outlook integration, your instant messaging, used to be called Link, is now Skype for Business, your OneDrive, your Yammer, your Delve, Power BI, all above and beyond SharePoint are all part of the Office 365 suite. And that suite continues to grow and add as Microsoft adds new feature sets into that. So there's a number of plans if you want to buy the full package, if you want to get everything together. And they fall into 2 main categories, which is business and enterprise. First glance, you look at them and say, well, why would I spend $3 a month more on the Enterprise E1 plan over the Office 365 Business Essentials that give me roughly the same things, but one costs a fair bit more than the other? And I'll get into the differences and show you what those are. Also, as you look at things like E1 and E3, those are roughly equivalent to the standard and the enterprise features that we talked about on-premise. So if there's certain feature sets that you need, the BI, the richer search and such, that's part of the E3 license. So if we look at the differences, there's also the ability to purchase just SharePoint Online itself, so what's called a Plan 1 and a Plan 2 of SharePoint Online. Again, equivalent to the standard and enterprise CAL. So Plan 1 is the standard features, Plan 2 is the enterprise features. And you look at this and you say, well, the Plan 1 of SharePoint Online is $5 a month, but the full Office 365 Business Essentials that includes that is $5.10 a month. These are Canadian full retail prices. They're not discounted. Everybody has their own discount level with Microsoft, but they are Canadian currency prices. There are advantages to the SharePoint Online plan over the Business Essentials, though, that we'll get into from here. But the main difference between the business and the enterprise plans, first off, there's a seat cap. So obviously enterprise means big organizations. So if you have more than 300 staff, you have to be in an enterprise plan. You can't use the business plan. But the big one for hybrid is what's called the on-premise CAL rights. And what this means is, do you remember earlier on I was talking about you may not have software assurance, you may not be licensed for SharePoint 2013 on-premise because your licenses were for 2007 or 2010. And in your hybrid scenario, you actually want to run 2013 and Office 365. You can use the enterprise subscription and not have to purchase CALs for your users for the on-premise. Basically, the enterprise licenses give you right to use your on-premise SharePoint without buying CALs for those users. So that's an important point, and that really explains a lot of the difference in the pricing between the two. The same applies to the SharePoint Online plan. So if you get SharePoint Online Plan 1 or Plan 2, these two plans here, they have the same on-premise rights for SharePoint that the enterprise plans have as well. If you're going to be doing a hybrid, there's really two scenarios. If you want to use the latest version of SharePoint and you're not licensed for it, you should probably use a SharePoint Online or a hybrid plan for that. If you're interested is staying on 2007 or 2010 for a subset of what you're doing and everything else goes in the cloud and you don't really care about getting your on-premise licensing current, then you're okay to use your existing CALs. You know, those are perpetual CALs, they don't expire. You can continue to use them and go with the business plan if you're a smaller organization. So some of the things to think about as you're looking at the subscriptions around 365. Some of the other things to think about, if you look at the middle of both the business and the enterprise, there's also the Office 365 Business and the Office 365 Pro Plus. And what that does is that rolls Office desktop licensing into this as well. So if you want your staff to be licensed for the latest versions of Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., with Office 2013 on their desktop, actually the cheapest way to do that is through these plans here. If you're going to be doing the Office 365 as well, bump that up, bring the Pro Plus into that, and that gives you the desktop licensing. And it's not just for a single desktop, it actually gives you rights for each staff member to install Office on 5 desktop devices, 5 tablets, and 5 mobile devices per user. So basically everybody's should be allocated for all their devices. I don't know many people that have more than 15 devices they use on a regular basis that they need Office on. And the nice thing is that's not just Microsoft devices. They've done a fantastic job of rolling out both iOS and Android support for Office across the full stack. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, OneDrive, Delve. In fact, a lot of these things are coming out first on the iOS, then on the Android, and then lastly on the Windows Phone architecture. So they're recognizing where their market is and where people want to be using them. Okay, so that's licensing background. Apologies, you know, it doesn't go all the way into the depths there. It hopefully gives you enough information to make you dangerous and ask the right questions to your large account reseller that you deal with in terms of doing your licensing, making sure that you're making the right choices there. So let's switch gears and go into a couple of scenarios here. There's 4 main scenarios that I want to cover off here for the balance of the webinar session. The first is hybrid intranet. You've got a staff portal, an intranet, and you want to blend that between on-premise and Office 365. Second is you've got a public website. You want to put that up in Azure. The third is you want to spin up an extranet. Let's put that in Office 365. And the fourth is you want to do a full dev and test environment. You don't want to spin that up on-premise. Let's do that in Azure. Let's dive down into each of those scenarios and kind of walk through what that looks like. We'll start with the hybrid intranet. So this is really about leveraging the full rich experience of Office 365 for the main company intranet. If you think about a staff portal and the content that's in there, the vast majority of that content is fine from most people's point of view to put into the cloud. If you look at a risk qualification on that or a confidentiality level on that, it's not typically high confidentiality. We're talking about staff announcements, news, staff directories, you know, not completely public information, but fairly public information. We're not getting into personal HR information, you know, in healthcare organizations, personal health information, things that tend to be more private and confidential. So for that less confidential information, why not leverage the richer 365 experience? All the new experiences we were talking about with video portals, knowledge management portals, Delve, which is awesome for knowledge discovery, that's all part of the 365 experience. So leverage that there. There may be confidential data, though, that you want to keep on premises, or as I mentioned before, there may be some custom code customizations you've done to your on-premises SharePoint. You're not ready to move to the cloud. It's going to take too long to re-engineer that. You want to hold that back until later. So keep that on-premise, but provide a seamless experience across both environments. We're actually living this ourselves at Envision IT. So we have a hybrid environment that's in the midst of transitioning as we speak. If I come over to my browser session here, and I come to the home of our intranet, I'm actually currently in Office 365, even though today the bulk of our intranet is actually still in our on-premises. And there's a couple of reasons around that. Part of that is the media experts. It takes time to migrate that. We haven't finished that. Part of that is that we have feature sets and customizations we've done, but we haven't quite got ready for the cloud. So we're working through those things. But we want to start to leverage the cloud and move that forward. We've got our branding and look and feel. We've got our navigation. One of the key things for me personally is making sure that there's a consistent navigation across that whole experience. So I look at the link on the home there that's going to envisionit.sharepoint.com. It's the page that we're on right now. Anytime you see .sharepoint.com, you know that you're on a SharePoint Online or Office 365 site. If I come over to one of our other sites, like our development site, that's actually pointing me to secure.envisionit.com, which is on our on-premises. You'll see it's the exact same nav structure that we've got between the two. In fact, we could have the same look and feel on there. For now, I actually want to keep it separate and keep it very clear to people that I'm on the on-premise one or I'm on the cloud one as I go through there. So we've actually started to migrate some of that content across. If I come into operations and I take that same URL that we have on the on-premise side and go to development, type that right. We actually have that same development site in Office 365. We don't want our staff to be using it yet because this is actually, first passes through of doing migrations. We're still doing some user acceptance testing, resolving some errors that we had in the migration. We're actually using a tool called ShareGate to do that migration. So they've done some great work in integrating with what Microsoft's done to speed up the migration process. So this was about, I think, 40 gig worth of content that we migrated over last weekend. It took about 20 hours to do that migration. So we were looking at close to 2 gig an hour in terms of throughput to move that across. So if you're looking to do a hybrid migration, that sort of couple gig an hour is probably a typical speed that you're going to see through that. There's enhancement and tricks that you can use to go beyond that, of running multiple sessions and things, but that's sort of a reasonable benchmark to use on there. If I come back to my home page here, though, one of the key things I wanted is on all of our staff to start their day in Office 365, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Yes, we can build a nice, rich homepage here, and we're actually rolling up content from our Twitter feed. We've got our staff list and our IM presence there. We actually have our content from our on-premises public website that's hosted in SharePoint getting surfaced up here as well. So we're actually using cross-site search to have Office 365 do searches against our public website and say, okay, here's the event that we're in here today. Here's some of the recent events we had around customer case studies, experience branding and navigation, the news around the awards that we've won and such. So our staff see that without having to go to our public website. So we can blend those experiences within one user session and see that all together. In fact, we need to be blending our Yammer experience in here as well. That's one of the next steps we're going to be taking in terms of our portal experience for our staff. Our clients, though, a lot of our client content is actually on our client sites that are still back in our on-premise. We actually expose that as an extranet, and we're still finishing off some last few changes to that extranet to make that available for our outside clients to come into Office 365. So it's all coming together quite nicely from that point of view and providing a unified experience through there. Now, we don't have a consistent search experience across that, and I'll talk in a minute about hybrid search and what that looks like. Because ideally, in addition to the branding and the navigation, you're going to want a single consistent search across that experience. And that's achievable to a certain degree today. Later in 2015, that's actually going to be a better experience from that perspective. Let me come back to our deck here. So things to think about, I mentioned the common branding and navigation. Single sign-in is actually really important as well. So if I come back to my site here, let me actually just close my browser down completely. And I'll say I want to come and open up Internet Explorer, and we've set our default homepage to be our online premise. You'll see it's going to adfs.envisionit.com. That's how our single sign-in is happening. It's going through a couple of redirects there, but ultimately, I as a user didn't have to sign on to the site. The portal just came up immediately for me in Office 365. And you're going to want that experience. If you're going to make your home page for your staff and your browsers be your corporate intranet, you can't force them to log in. Because the reality is most of the time they don't actually want to go there. They're not going to bother logging in, and they're not going to chance upon interesting content that's fresh and new on that site. So you really want to make sure you address that single sign-on component to that as well. And then the hybrid search I mentioned, providing a single search experience across both on-premise and online is very important. If you want to get deeper into that, there's a great talk from Ignite back in May that spends an hour and a quarter just on that topic and some of the things around that. I grabbed a couple of the slides out of that just to give you some context around that. So with SharePoint Server 2013, so it doesn't apply to 2007 or 2010, but if you're running 2013 on-premise, there is the hybrid search you can use using what's called query federation. So what happens is I type a search in on-premise, and it actually sends that search both out to online and into your on-premise SharePoint. It actually comes back as two result sets. So from a refining and sorting point of view, it's not entirely ideal because you actually see two different things going on there. And all the search components need to be current with 2013 and running on premises. Now what they've announced, though, for later in calendar year 2015 is that they're going to provide a single search experience across both on-premise and Office 365. And this isn't just for search. This also applies to the other experiences like Delve. So if you're not familiar with Delve, have a look at my my Office 365 overview, which was the first of this series. This is an awesome tool for discovering content and information. And it uses search tremendously in order to surface that up. So basically what will happen is what you do on-premise as well as what you do online in Office 365 all gets collected and tracked through Delve, applied machine learning against that, and then provides a single Delve experience across that. So this is what's coming. So Microsoft recognizes that hybrid is here for some time to go, and they're making investments both in the on-premise and in the cloud to support that hybrid environment. So let's switch gears now and talk about Azure public websites. So if you've got your public site on SharePoint, Azure is something you should really think about. It's a great way to surface that up externally. A lot of our clients in the past have had private hosting where they've had, their own hardware co-located in a data center and managed by a third party to host their public-facing website on SharePoint. Azure does that same thing, but in a much more cost-effective way. It provides the ability for Microsoft to provide that server infrastructure at a very low cost, and then you install SharePoint on top of that. You don't need to build out a whole DMZ infrastructure. You get the full SharePoint functionality. This is not a cloud version. This is the same version that you would be running on-premise. And it's very elastic. If you're an organization whose needs go up and down, maybe you're a retailer in November, December, your web traffic just goes through the roof. Do you want to buy infrastructure to support that 12 months a year, or do you want to just scale it up in Azure and say, well, let's have that available for those 2 months, and when I don't need it, I don't pay for it. So it's a great way to do that. So actually, that's the link I was referring to before, the blog site article that I took you that talks about the different scenarios around that. The next is around Office 365 Extranets, and this is one that's very near and dear to my heart. I mean, we have an Extranet User Manager product that's all about Extranets, and it was originally designed specifically for on-premises SharePoint. About a year and a half ago, we started a big project for the Supreme Court of Victoria in Australia for a case management system, and that was originally designed to be an Office 365 site. Somewhat surprisingly, here's a foreign government that was willing to put their data in a US data center, because at that time there weren't Australian Azure and Office 365 data centers. There are today. They opened about 6 months ago in Sydney and Melbourne. So that was really our first experience with Office 365, and that's where we recognized, this is where the opportunity is going forward. Why do clients want to build a DMZ? And when we start talking with on-premises installations of Extranets, we quickly get deep into the weeds with their security officers, their IT folks, around firewalls and certificates and trusts between domains and all sorts of complexity it really slows down these projects and makes them much more costly. Office 365 takes that all off the table because it's outside of your environment. And honestly, if you're looking at replacing ad hoc extranet solutions, like most organizations, they use their email as an external collaboration tool, and they do lots of email attachments. That is about the least secure way of doing any sort of external sharing. As soon as you hit send on that email to an external party, you have no idea where that flows through the internet and whose mail servers it goes through and who snoops it along the way. So you really want to raise the bar from that point of view. You can do Dropbox and Box and things like that as external solutions, but if you're already using SharePoint from a collaboration point of view, why do you want to introduce another external solution? Put that in Office 365, still have your on-premise for your SharePoint, tie those together so it's a single user experience for your internal users and your external staff come into Office 365. Now you can do that out of the box with 365 using a feature called external sharing. Honestly, I haven't met anybody in the outside world that has really adopted that and is a fan of that. I mean, it's a very cumbersome onboarding process for external users. It's fraught with errors, and there's a real lack of governance around that. Microsoft's improving that. I've been working with the product manager. He's got some great ideas of where they're going with that. But the interim, we see our Extranet user manager solution as a much better solution around that. And even longer term, we see ourselves going beyond what Microsoft really wants to do out of the box. We provide the full user experience of branding, of custom certificates and vanity URLs and such that you don't get in a Microsoft hosted solution. You've got a customized user registration and approvals process around that. So if you want to explore that, hop over to our www.extranetusermanager.com site. We run complimentary webinars there, more focused on the extranet side, obviously. We're going to be announcing our August webinar shortly on that side as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that side if that's the scenario that you're looking at. If you're thinking about an extranet and you don't have a full SharePoint and a DMZ ready to go already, I think you should think long and hard about whether you want to be doing that or whether you should be looking at Office 365. Even from a licensing point of view, Microsoft has declared that the external users, regardless of how they come in, are going to be treated the same as on-premise, where they don't need a subscription. So let's say you've got 100 staff and they need to collaborate with 500 external parties. You buy 100 Office 365 subscriptions for your staff. Those 500 external people, regardless of how frequently or infrequently they come in, you're not paying a subscription for those people. Those are external users from Microsoft's point of view. And there's some rules around that. We've worked with franchise organizations where the franchisees, are not employees of the parent company. Those are still considered not at arm's length and not external users. So if you need an exact definition of that, that's where you probably need to draw in a Microsoft licensing expert on that side. The last scenario I want to cover off is around dev and test. So if you're running a heavily customized environment, you've built add-ins, apps, things like that, really you don't want to be trying those out in your production environment. You should have a full development, test, QA, production, perhaps even pre-production environments to take the customizations that you've built through a full life cycle. Do you want to build all that environment on-premise, or do you want to just host that up in Azure? And Azure has a very compelling argument around that. So if you think about your on-premise data center resources, those are often precious resources and they're limited resources. If you have developers on staff, depending on how they purchase Visual Studio, they'll have different MSDN, which is the Microsoft Developer Network, licensing rights to use the full product in dev and test environments without buying licenses for them. That can cause significant price savings. Also, if you don't need the environment up and running all the time, you only pay for what you need. So think about a test environment. Maybe you want to keep that running all business hours every day. So 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you want to run that. If you compare that to running it 7/24 on your on-premise infrastructure or running that 7/24 on Azure, you're actually only running it for 24% of the time. So if we go back to my blog article for a second here. And let me just pull up that overview of pricing. Let's say we wanted to have a 4-server farm for a dev farm for our company. If we left that on all the time, we'd be paying $1,900 a month for that farm. If we ran it 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, we'd only pay 24% of that, so less than $500 a month for that. It goes further than that, though. If you use your MSDN licenses, you get Azure usage rights and reduced rates. So you get a certain credit every month that you don't have to pay for, and you also get up to about 30% off of those costs there as well. You can bring that $500 down to $300 a month if you're running it every day, every business during business hours. Say you only need that test environment 1 week out of the month, suddenly that $300 is starting to come down to less than $100. That's for your 4-server farm. You can't touch that from an on-premise hosting point of view in terms of the infrastructure costs related to that. So very compelling argument in terms of looking at that from a dev and test point of view. You can mix that up, and basically when you shut it down, there's some rules around how you shut it down. I'm actually going to be putting a blog post up shortly on how to automate that and the scripts involved to do that properly to make sure that you don't incur charges on that. Basically, you're just paying dollars for the storage from that point forward. So very cost effective from that point of view. So I think we're pretty much wrapped there. We just got one more poll that I want to do here. So I've taken you through 4 different scenarios. I want to get a sense which resonate with people and which are most likely to be pursued from there. Let me just open that up. So if we think about the hybrid intranet, you've got a portion of your intranet that you're comfortable putting in the cloud and it makes sense, and a portion that you're not and you want to keep on premise. How do you blend that together, provide a unified experience, and really leverage all the cloud has to offer for that portion that's up in the cloud? So that's number 1. Number 2 being the Azure public website. So you've got a site that you're either building or you've built that's running on SharePoint. Do you need to maintain that infrastructure in-house, have a DMZ and all the servers and stuff involved with that, or should that just go up into Azure? 365 Extranets, so you want to collaborate with external parties. Again, you don't want to spin up a DMZ, bring that environment in through there. How do we get that up very easily and very quickly? We see 365 as a great way to do that. And lastly, Azure Dev and Test. You don't want to run your own test environment on-premise and use those precious resources, so we put that up into Azure. So interesting, the Azure public websites and the Dev and Test, not so much. Predominantly, people interested in the hybrid intranet, that's 75% of the responses there, and about a quarter from an Office 365 Extranets point of view. So interesting to see. So let me close that out. We've been taking questions as we've been going. Haven't really got a lot of questions that we've been going through there. We've got only 2 minutes left in there. One of them was around slide deck going to be available after the fact. Absolutely. So the deck will go up shortly, and we'll be putting up a recording within the next day or so as well. So if there aren't any further questions, we'll wrap it up from there. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a follow-on survey, Amanda. That's going to be...
It's just going to pop up at the end of the webinar.
Okay. Yeah. So absolutely, if you don't mind filling in that survey at the end of the webinar, that feedback is very valuable to us to guide future seminars that we're going to be doing. Again, thanks very much, and have a great day.